Good evening, everybody. As I mentioned a moment ago, this program is being recorded. I'll start off because this is very personal to me. In 1978, the neo-Nazis wanted to march in Skokie. Neo-Nazi march in Skokie, and as all of you probably know, Skokie was at that time really where a lot of Holocaust survivors had gathered, had bought homes and were living. The mayor of Skokie banned them from marching, got a city ordinance to ban them. And of course, the First Amendment prevailed. And they were allowed to march. Now, they never did march, mainly because they feared for their life if they did, different issue. So they marched elsewhere. But the question I have for everyone is this. If there had been a law that said they weren't allowed to march, it would have been over. But because they were allowed to march, the survivors, the Holocaust survivors in Skokie came together, and step by step, they built this modern, beautiful museum we have in Skokie today, the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center, a place where, as most of you know, I volunteer as a docent and second generation speaker currently at least twice, if not 3 times a week. My point being, that's how you fight against hate speech. You fight it with free contra speech. You know, another comment, if you allow me, I'm an adamant defender of free speech, and I look at it not so much because I fear that my free speech will be taken away, because to be quite honest, no one listens to me anyway. But I'm afraid my right to go into the marketplace of ideas will be taken away. I make this analogy. If I want to buy a new shirt, I can go to the mall. I can look at all the shirts there. I can reject the ones I don't like. I can buy the ones I do like. Well, in the marketplace of ideas, I want to go into that marketplace. I want to hear all the ideas, and I want to reject the ones I don't like. And I want to buy into those that I do like. And I feel this very strongly, the right wing of this country. I don't want the right wing of this country impeding me if I want to, well, for argument's sake, go to a drag show at a library or bakery. But I equally and adamantly will not allow the left wing of this country to stop me or impede me from, I don't know, seeing a Dave Chappelle show in Minneapolis, for instance. And I give other examples. I'll stop with that. But nobody tonight signed up to hear me speak. We signed up to hear Joe Cohn speak. So let me introduce you to Joe. Joe is a former staff attorney for the United States Court of Appeals for the Third Circuit, and a former law clerk for the Philadelphia Court of Common Pleas. And he was just sharing with me, he's got other responsibilities now. But as importantly, Joe is currently director of the Legislative and Policy Department of FIRE, F-I-R-E. FIRE is the acronym for the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. And I got to tell you something, I found FIRE on Facebook, I read articles. They are going to court all the time. They constantly, from lower court all the way to the Supreme Court, fighting for free speech. And I love this organization. I'm a big fan, making donations personally, Mickey and I. Joe, stop me from talking and take it away, please. You're muted. Joe, you're muted. Still muted. You're still muted. There you go.
Okay, sorry about that. Ron, thank you so much for the kind introduction and wonderful words about my office. And thank you so much for the invitation to join your congregation tonight. Across the United States and the broader world, people are becoming increasingly polarized. Too often, people are living in their own echo chambers, consuming media exclusively from sources that they identify with politically, distrusting information from the sources that they identify with their political adversaries. And at the same time, our discourse is increasingly confrontational, nasty, and sometimes rooted in our prejudices. If any of you have been on Twitter lately, you probably know what I'm talking about. We live in a country that boasts of the strongest protections for freedom of speech in the world. But as the rhetoric ramps up and as bigoted speech seems to flourish, many, and perhaps even some of you, may be wondering whether allowing bigoted speech is a sound approach. Tonight, I'll follow Ron's lead and make the case for why it is. While I'm not known for my brevity, I'll try to keep my prepared remarks a little bit on the shorter side so that as much of our time as possible can be dedicated to open dialogue rather than lecture. I'm also not going to be looking at a tight, time where I, won't go any further. So if the conversation rolls on, the conversation rolls on. A good place to start with the conversation is with the following, which comes to a surprise to many people. I'm going to say it up front. There is no hate speech exception to the First Amendment. Contrary to a common misconception, most expression one might identify as hate speech is protected by the First Amendment and cannot be lawfully censored, punished, or unduly burdened by the government. The Supreme Court of the United States has repeatedly rejected attempts to prohibit or punish hate speech. Instead, nearly 100 years of jurisprudence reflects that the First Amendment provides a broad guarantee of freedom for the thought that we hate, as Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes described the concept in a dissent in a case called U.S. v. Schwimmer back in 1929. So defending the right of free speech for the ideas we hate the most is not easy. And that's at least in part because the old childhood adage that sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me is total BS. As Chief Justice Roberts explained powerfully in the Snyder versus Phelps decision, which upheld the right of members of the Westboro Baptist Church to picket at military funerals of gay soldiers. I'm using his words for a second here. Speech is powerful. It can stir people to action, move them to tears of both joy and sorrow, and as it did here, inflict great pain. On the facts before us, we cannot react to that pain by punishing the speaker. As a nation, we have chosen a different course to protect even hurtful speech on public issues to ensure that we do not stifle public debate. So it's precisely because words are powerful that they must be protected. And there are 2 points, two that are naturally embedded here. The first is that protections for the most heated, controversial speech are the most necessary. After all, that's the speech that's at the highest risk of being censored. No one is trying to censor videos of kittens and puppies. No one. If the Constitution only protected that which was not so controversial, its protections would largely be symbolic. And the second point is one about democracy. The First Amendment case law reflects the fact that the government cannot regulate hate speech without inevitably silencing the dissent and dialogue that democracy requires. And since this seems like as good a time as any to go on a tangent, this point about democracy underscores an aspect of the First Amendment that I find particularly interesting. Protections for free speech are absolutely necessary for a democracy to function properly. And at the same time, free speech protections are inherently anti-democratic. And what I mean by that is that the freedom of speech is especially crucial to protecting the rights of those holding unpopular views. The First Amendment prohibits those in the majority and governments representing those majorities from stifling dissent. And this is true even if 99 out of 100 people in the community hate the speech that's in question. So it really is a check on majority power. So returning to my point that prohibitions on hate speech would undermine democracy, it's important to remember that democracy cannot flourish if speech is sanitized. And a case that I like to talk about to illustrate this is Cohen versus California. In that case, that's the case where the Supreme Court importantly recognized that one man's vulgarity is another's lyric. In that case, the court used the First Amendment to overturn the conviction of Paul Robert Cohen, who was convicted of disturbing the peace by protesting the Vietnam War by wearing a jacket that read, "Fuck the draft," while he was in a courthouse. Could Mr. Cohen have worn a jacket that said, "I don't like the draft," instead of the one that used profanity? I mean, sure. But had he done so, he wouldn't have captured the nation's attention. It was that he used shocking language that made it something to discuss across the country. And indeed, every advancement in civil rights in our nation's history has been secured, at least in part, because of the willingness of people to use their free speech in provocative ways, to change minds. It's easy to imagine women's suffrage being discussed politely over tea. But the reality is that suffragists marched, they chanted, and sometimes they even showed their ankles to demand change. I mean, it was really revolutionary stuff. And this underscores that even if the government can't prohibit or punish hateful speech, people are not entirely powerless to respond to it. After all, we have our own right to challenge hateful remarks through debate, protest, questioning, laughter, silence, or simply walking away. And that is, the point that Ron was making in his opening analogy about shopping in the store and the marketplace of ideas. In his concurring opinion in Whitney versus California, Justice Louis Brandeis described the framers' understanding of the essential nature of meaningful free speech protections to a democracy. And he wrote, and this is the longest quote that I'm going to give tonight, but it's really important to hear what he had to say in full. So I quote, "Those who won our independence believed that the final end of the state was to make men free to develop their faculties, and that in its government and deliberative forces should prevail over the arbitrary. They valued liberty, both as an end and a means. They believed liberty to be the secret of happiness, and courage to be the secret of liberty. They believed that freedom to think as you will and to speak as you think are means indispensable to the discovery and spread of political truth. And without free speech and assembly, discussion would be futile. That with them, discussions afford ordinarily adequate protection against the dissemination of noxious doctrine, that the greatest menace to freedom is an inert people, that public discussion is a political duty, and that this should be a fundamental principle of American government. They recognized the risks to which all human institutions are subject, but they knew that order cannot be secured merely through fear, punishment for its infraction, that it is hazardous to discourage thought, hope, and imagination, that fear breeds repression, that repression breeds hate, that hate menaces stable government, that path of society lies in the opportunity to discuss freely supposed grievances and proposed remedies, and that the fitting remedy for evil counsels is good ones. Believing in the power of reason as applied through public discussion, they eschewed silence coerced by law, the argument of force in its worst form. Recognizing the occasional tyrannies of governing majorities, they amended the Constitution so that free speech and assembly could be guaranteed." I know that was a mouthful, and I know that I was reading for a little while there, but Justice Brandeis's argument is a really salient one about how crucial it is for us to listen to even the worst ideas. And that brings me to my next point, which is it's nearly impossible to ban hateful speech without also restricting political speech, because what's hateful is inherently subjective. Remember the fuck the draft case we discussed just a few minutes ago, where the Supreme Court held that one man's vulgarity is another's lyric? This inherent subjectivity is exactly what they were talking about. So I have two, last points I hope to turn to before we go, to have an open dialogue about free speech and how to contest hateful arguments that are out there in the world. And I start by saying defining hate speech is an impossible task because it is a moving target. And, it was Nadine Strossen, former president of the ACLU, who calls hate speech the moving target. And as society's norms evolve, the ideas that are so awful that they must be banished from public discourse change. In 1984, for just one example, the Board of Regents of Texas A&M University sought to deny recognition to a gay student organization because it believed, and I'm quoting them for a second, so-called gay activities run diabolically counter to the traditions and standards of Texas A&M. That was their argument. At the time, the board voiced the majority view of that era, which found the gay student speech to be beyond the pale. Of course, this is a view that is held by many fewer in academia and society at large today. And the lesson to be learned from that is that today's majority viewpoints must not be allowed to foreclose those of tomorrow. We cannot lock ourselves in to 2023 thinking, because 2023 thinking might not be as enlightened as we think it is. And the final point that I want to end my prepared remarks on is that it's easy for each of us to imagine that if the government had broader powers to police speech, it would choose the lines of what it would protect and what it would restrict exactly where each one of us would set those lines. But historically, that has not borne true. Indeed, in countries where hate speech laws are lawful, they've been used to stifle dissent consistently. And the examples are, plentiful. In Pakistan, people have been arrested and sentenced to death for blasphemy, for insulting Islam. In Egypt, in 2017, 7 people were arrested for debauchery, for waving rainbow flags at concerts. That same year, there were 30 Turkish journalists facing consecutive life sentences for their anti-government articles. All of these people were prosecuted under hate speech laws. In the United Kingdom, where a man was convicted for his anti-military Facebook, comments, it just would not be able to happen in the United States because of the First Amendment. In France, a man was fined for holding up a sign saying, "Get lost, jerk," to French President Sarkozy. And what's ironic about that is that Sarkozy used those exact same words to a critic who refused to shake his hand during a public event. And that was the point of the man holding up the sign to him, to criticize him for that very same language. The point is, wherever governments have had power to regulate hateful speech, they have used that power to stifle dissent every single time. Every single country that has had laws that allow that has done so. So that's, kind of the argument that I wanted to present to you today. And I hope that the rest of the time we can spend talking about it. I want to hear from you. I'm happy to hear your thoughts. I'm happy to respond and, take questions. And thank you so much for having me over.
Marla, I'm going to give you the opportunity. I'm not going to read your question. I'm going to give you the opportunity to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Okay. For me, there's a difference between hate speech that's essentially benign. People say bad things all the time, especially within your own family. But the difference between that and speech which incites violence, is illegal, sedition, any of these things are related to speech. And your point that it never works is interesting because Germany actually has laws against Holocaust deniers and anti-Semitic speech.
Yeah, and they haven't really worked. They haven't been able to really cure the problem of anti-Semitism in that country. And in fact, polarizes in a way that breeds out extremism. And one of the things I would say, you know, is that when you make certain speech illegal, you don't end the sentiments behind it. You push people underground where they talk in echo chambers to only people who agree with them. And it really kind of solidifies it. And that's been an experience, you know, that's been observed, you know, over and over again. I think to your first point, I don't disagree. The First Amendment isn't absolute. You know, there are exceptions to it. There isn't a hate speech exception, though. There is an exception for incitement. That's a case called Brandenburg versus Ohio. It's a very specific, you know, test in terms of, you know, speech that's likely to produce imminent acts of lawlessness. The theory, you know, in, you know, Brandenburg, and I think it's a sound one, is that when you're trying to parse between who's responsible for activities of a mob, and you're trying to figure out whether it's the speaker or the rioters, it's helpful to know, and important and crucial, in fact, to know whether or not the mob had a chance to evaluate the truthfulness of the claim, you know, chance to kind of think it through, or whether or not they're spurred, you know, to action immediately. And that's why, you know, the same words could be protected in one context, and the exact same speech could be unprotected in another. You're giving a fiery speech, you know, that's homophobic in front of a crowd of torch-bearing, you know, people who, you know, have already expressed a sentiment and willingness to commit violent acts against that group, you know, right outside of a gay nightclub, is far more likely to create and incite violence than if those exact same words were read by that same person on this Zoom. I don't think anyone in this audience would be so whipped up about that they'd march their way over, you know, to a gay nightclub and, you know, and commit acts of violence. So it's very fact specific. There are other exceptions, including, you know, discriminatory harassment that is unlawful in both educational contexts and in employment contexts. But again, very precise definitions. And that's one of the other kind of lessons that is, you know, really important in the First Amendment world, which is, you often hear, well, the First Amendment isn't absolute, is an argument to kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater. If there are any exceptions, then surely we can also prohibit X or Y or Z. And the exceptions are generally very, very narrow and very well defined.
Is there a point for aspirational ethics in a society, pro-social behavior, separate from speech? How would that play out?
Well, it plays out, you know, as Ron was kind of teeing it up in terms of a remedy for bad speeches. It's more speech in terms of, you know, the wisdom from Justice Brandeis that the best counsel, you know, the best remedy for evil counsels is good counsel. You know, you want to show leadership by example. You know, when I speak on a college campus, I remind people that we don't allow to have civility codes that tell people how, you know, inflammatory or provocative they can make their arguments. But it's also helpful to remind them that the loudest, most obnoxious fist slammer doesn't always win, and that, you know, you get to decide your own tone, but others are the ones who get to decide if you're persuasive and if they want to listen to you. And you know, so I think there's something to be said for people through leading through example, but I'm unfamiliar with any examples of people who have defeated bigotry through censorship, where the bigots changed their mind because they were censored. You know, there are a lot of examples. There's a really prominent one you can Google, and CNN articles, NPR coverage of Daryl Davis, who some of you might be familiar with, but he was a musician who was touring through the South, and he was African American. He's like 6'4", grew up, you know, a military brat, and grew up overseas. and he was on tour. I think he played with Chuck Berry actually, and in a bar in the South when a member of the Ku Klux Klan approached him and started, yelling at him. And instead of like getting confrontational, he asked the guy to join him for a drink, and they spent 4 or 5 hours just talking. He bought the guy dinner, and and met him again the next night, and started just striking up conversations and dialogue instead. And what puzzled him was, how could someone possibly hate me when they've never met me? And they actually became friends. And from that day forward, Daryl Davis made it kind of a hobby to go out of his way to find members of the Klan and try to engage them. And those that became his friends would turn into him their Klan robes. And he has 27 or 28 Ku Klux Klan robes in this ginormous walk-in closet now, because he's made that his like kind of life mission of engaging. But I'm unfamiliar with anyone who's ever been punished into thinking that they were wrong and changing their ways through censorship.
I don't expect for minds to be changed. That would not be my goal. It would be for people to be protected who could not protect themselves. And I think we have more examples of that than any kind of speech changing someone's mind. So I'm fine with that. I may not like it. I worked and still work with the same population of fundamental Christians, and I'm Jewish, and have listened to anti-Semitic remarks, them not knowing I was Jewish, yet they're my patients. So I walk a thin line in how I manage that. It's not my goal to change their beliefs. But if someone's disturbed, I actually have a duty to warn, a legal duty to warn if they're going to hurt somebody.
Yeah, but there are contexts where language itself crosses certain legal thresholds, like we discussed, harassment thresholds, incitement thresholds, true threats that are not, hyperbolic. But there's also a tremendous trend of the argument of safetyism that conflates being insulted with being in danger. And, words are not violence. Violence is violence. Words are the alternative to violence. So that's not to say that there isn't an appropriate response when you hear hateful arguments in public settings like that, to demonstrate to others who might be hurt in the, I'm not talking physical hurt, but upset, offended, rightfully so, potentially by that. But you do that through support and not through punishment. I mean, other than that, there really is not that. I don't understand the duty that you're describing beyond that, though.
If somebody tells me that they're going to hurt or kill someone, I'm required to contact the person and tell them they're in danger.
Sure, but that's a true threat, and that would be true whether it was about a hateful reason, whether it was a bigoted reason or a non-bigoted reason. If it's, if it was their own family member or whatever. I mean, there are absolutely exceptions, but there isn't an exception to someone is saying something that's racist and therefore they must be punished.
And I'm not saying that that's the case. I'm saying that building speech over time that is hateful and then gets accepted by society bit by bit makes it, more likely that there's physical acting out, violence. I think really there's more examples of that than not, if you look at some countries.
I mean, I think that anytime you get into a society where you don't contest that, where it's accepted without the remedy of the better dialogue as well, where you don't have people, combating it through, counter narratives and showing better examples, then I don't disagree But I don't think that those are the only, two options of either you censor or you let things go in their entirety until they also fester in that particular way. I think that that's a kind of a false, choice.
I don't either. I don't either. I think
Yeah,
you
and
misrepresented what I'm saying. Well, I'll let some other people
sure.
respond.
I see another hand up.
Mark, I'll go ahead. Mark, go ahead.
Okay, I want to follow up with something you said a little bit earlier, Joe. And thank you for your comments already. It's been very interesting. But you talked about lies and truthfulness. And how do you fight against lies? Because when I listen to people talk now, first of all, it just turns me off when I hear lies. It's hard to give them any credence, but there's a significant amount of population that is in another world. And I know we can say, well, that's my perspective, but is there in the law an absolute truth that
Well,
you're going to say that this is a lie or this is libel or whatever? And how do you counter that?
yeah, that is not an easy one, and no softballs for me tonight, I see. Okay, so there are contexts where lying is unprotected. The whole concept of fraud is based on that, but also requires there to be some form of transaction and act in, in detriment, et cetera, that makes it more conduct based than not. I won't argue at all that we are having a societal issue of political disagreements that are so intense that the camps are unwilling to concede some of the common fact bases that are out there, and that has profound societal implications. But there are also profound societal implications that go beyond a blip in time when you empower governments to set what is fact and what's fiction in political disputes. That's not to say that I don't, also agree that there, are some contexts where that's regulable. For example, you might be able to regulate it in terms of the doctor-patient relationship to know that a doctor is giving you accurate, information. However, you also, even in that context, can't have a situation where the government is deciding that some forms of advice that are within the standard of care set by the profession are off the table for political reasons without having First Amendment problems. So, this context that you're talking about in terms of disinformation and misinformation, it's real. It's a serious, problem that I don't think anyone has found a utopian perfect solution for. I think in most of the context, you're better off with a more speech remedy than a forced punishment, response, when in absence of the other factors like fraud or where there's duty of responsibility of care. When you're talking about people expressing their opinions, the only solution to get people to return back to a kind of a sanity is to confront with facts and data and verified things from a third party and third parties sources. I'm going to say something else here, which is also incumbent upon all of the various gatekeepers of truth, media sources, etc., to behave at their best more consistently too, which is not to say that I think that any particular, news reporter or news outlet is inaccurate or wrong, etc. But both sides of the political spectrum think that the other side's media sources are just too biased to ever listen to ever. And too many of them will blend in opinion sections and news sections, as opposed to having both, but having them separated more clearly. And, I wouldn't change a law to force them to do anything differently there. But I do think it is part of the solution is to be expecting of the media outlets that you like, that you appreciate, not the other side's media outlets, but giving them the feedback of, you know, clear divisions between the opinion news and the news. You know, I think that would help. That's not a fire position. That's a Joe Cone position. But no easy answers there.
Thank you.
Bob, you want to unmute yourself for your question? Bob or Myrna, would you unmute Bob, please?
I just wanted to say that there's something that's going on in this area now, which is a whole group, a church group, that is trying to remove books from the shelves of both the school and the public libraries. And as a former trustee of one of the large libraries, I appeared both at the high school which board and also at our local library board. And this is a group that is fundamental Christians who oppose anything to do with LGBT, make claims erroneously that the schools are promoting abhorrent sex. The state of Illinois just worked for several years on a sex education program, which was both age and grade appropriate for high school, and they violently object to that. They are allowed to opt out, but that's not good enough for them. They don't want it. They don't want anybody else to have it. So they want this censorship. And I find, so one of the things I said, not going to have any effect on them, of course, is to tell them that there's a series of books across the country that have been taken off the shelf by groups that have prevailed. And one of them, the most widely banned book in the country is, believe it or not, George Orwell's 1984. And if you remember with the theory of the thought police, ignorance is strength. And that was their theme. And that's what these people have. They don't know anything about it, but they come, and if they can get enough people on the board, they will prevail and have these things taken off the shelf. I don't know how any other than making sure that they're not the majority, you can handle a situation like that.
Yeah, I mean, I'll start by saying that your final observation is an important one, that at least on the ground, forgetting the court battles for just a second, because constitutional issues, aren't decided by majorities. What happens on the ground in terms of who shows up for these local elections dictates, what happens. And just showing up, voting and being in meetings, can make a difference. And people who are organizing these bans are more active, at that level of politics than their opponents. As a concerted several year, effort. Fire is, a member of the Banned Book Week Coalition to try to fight, censorship of banning books. We produced a video just, I think it was yesterday, about the decision by Puffin, the publisher, to
Terrible
to
decision.
take classics from Dahl and scrub them clean of words like the word ugly that they think are unfit for kids to read in 2023. I think there's a legal distinction to be made between school libraries and public libraries. There's a case called Pico from the Supreme Court. It was decided by a plurality. For those who are not lawyers, what that means is when there's a plurality decision in the Supreme Court, you don't have a simple majority that dictates what the rule will be for other cases. So you're only deciding the facts of that particular case, but it's instructive and kind of gives you insight about where, the court was thinking, and they cobbled together a plurality on different points in the decision in Pico, dealing with the removal of books in a junior high library. And what they say is in Pico is that a school library doesn't have an obligation to have, every book under the sun, but the test is that they have to be able to show that their decision to remove something was for a legitimate pedagogical purpose, or because it hadn't been checked out in a long time, something other than just raw political power of majoritarian preferences over books and disdain for particular ideas. And and you can think of that, there's some wisdom in that, even the most permissive advocate for, sexual speech might not want the most hardcore porn in the elementary school, library, and think that there's a certain thing about age appropriateness that allows for those decisions. Now, that rationale has never been applied in the same way for public libraries. And in fact, Justice Rehnquist, who was one of the dissenters in that Pico case, issued towards the end of his time on the Supreme Court a majority opinion in an American Library Association case, the ALA case, that was dealing with internet filters to filter out pornographic materials in public adult libraries, and decided they did not need to do the full First Amendment analysis because it was obvious to him in that 5-4 majority that public libraries have the ability to make those kind of content and even viewpoint-based decisions, and that it isn't a public forum where you're entitled to get whatever material you seek out. I don't personally agree with that decision, but it is the law of the land, which makes fighting these library impulses a challenge, because the case law isn't all that great. So you're fighting it on normative values, about the right to access information and the importance of having, adults, able to seek out the information they want without the most thin-skinned person deciding what's acceptable and what's not. And, we're still, at FIRE, we've only moved from our mission of being higher ed, civil liberties, to free speech for the whole nation about 6 months ago. So we're starting to grapple with these new contexts where the First Amendment questions hadn't come up to us in the previous 20 years. Thank you for your comment.
Marla, I'm going to not read your question. I'm going to invite you to unmute yourself and ask your question yourself. You can do it better than I can.
I was wondering how you felt about free speech with children. In the old days, when kids were bullied, cried, now they go home and kill themselves, or they get a gun and they go to school and they kill somebody else. So do we have a responsibility to teach our children appropriate behavior, even if it means inhibiting speech? I don't mean behavior pushing, shoving a kid, whatever. That's clear.
Sure.
I think we all agree on that. But the kind of things that hurt children are the words. And I know you said that that was not meaningful, but I work with kids and it's very meaningful.
No, I mean, I think I've actually said the opposite. I said, I think the sticks and stones can break my bones is utter, but words can never harm me is utter bullshit.
Oh, okay.
Because I think words are powerful. And, there's developed case law specifically on this point that I think, is pretty wise here. The case called Davis versus Monroe County Board of Education. And it sets the standard for when, expression crosses in that context, in the educational context, from being protected into being unprotected. And it's, the court, and as the court, defines it, says it has to be targeted at someone on the basis of a protected status. It needs to be objectively offensive to a reasonable person. So you're not just using the thinnest skinned person's, sensitivities. And it needs to be severe and pervasive, such that the target of the behavior would have access to the educational benefits, denied. And, it's a high threshold, importantly so, because you also, kids are also, mean to each other in milder ways that aren't quite as serious as you're describing, but you're absolutely right that it too often does rise to the level, and there are too many fact patterns that do meet the Davis standard. And, my boss, co-wrote Coddling of the American Mind, which talks for many chapters about that problem. And that there's something new now going on that wasn't going on in the past with the internet, because before the internet, and I'm going to backtrack for just a moment here. The data shows that there's a difference between bullying amongst boys and bullying amongst girls, in that bullying amongst boys is often includes more of a physical element, where bullying amongst, girls tends to be psychological torture, more often. And now with the internet and social media available 24/7, you don't just get home and don't have to face your bully. Your bully is still saying things in group social settings all evening, all night. So there's no retreat for these, for these kids. I think the legal standard is the right one and is a wise one, but schools have historically not been good at taking that seriously until I think around the last decade. And even so, still not consistently. So yeah, I mean, there's definitely, lines that can be crossed there.
I think I don't know if you have children, but if you've seen an autopsy of a 7-year-old who hung themselves because they were called fat or they wore glasses, you might rethink what that pattern looks like and what it leads to, and where adults could intervene earlier.
Well,
I'd be surprised if you didn't.
well, first of all, a couple things. One is that line is not the line between when a school can take any action. It's the line for when the speech can be punished. The difference there is a really crucial one, which is that schools have all sorts of non-punitive interventions that they can make, to be trying to make it better for the complainant, to try to engage, the alleged perpetrator as well, to reform behaviors and bring dialogue and bring people together. Punishment is not the only option. And way earlier in the process, I would agree with you that things need to be done, and that, schools are appropriate places to be trying that effort. Second, I would just say, my dad's also been a civil liberties lawyer, most of my life, general counsel of the ACLU of Nevada for over 20 years. And in his private practice has taken on and represented families who have had young kids commit suicide for exactly this reason. I completely agree with the instinct to want to take action here and the need for the government to do it. It is not an all or nothing scenario. And I'm certainly not making the argument that nothing can be done and everyone should be sitting on their hands.
But you do make the argument that once it's not a child, that it is okay.
No, I mean, once it's not a child, you're talking about adults in college. The legal standard is the same because the Supreme Court sets this threshold, for in the educational context. In the employment context where you're forced to be somewhere for work, there are also similar, even less speech protective, standards because people rely on their work for their livelihood as well. But when you were talking about just citizens to each other, we don't have a general civility code. That's not to say that there aren't other ways that can be unprotected, incitement, true threats. You can come up with, with nasty, horrible things that people can say. I'm not saying that doesn't affect people's mental health, but the alternative of being speech police has profound societal impacts as well. That, we can't just make the trade that we allow the government to punish things when we don't have set standards and set lines.
True, but I'm not just talking about the government. I think we have a responsibility as the watchers of children. But that doesn't stop as you see your neighbor, and maybe your neighbor is gay, and the rest of the neighborhood's going after that person. Don't you have a responsibility as a person to protect or to make a statement against that type of behavior? Or are you saying that's the way it is, suck it up, whatever?
I have said nothing of the sort.
Good.
I mean, I you know, I don't just, I mean, listen, I hope, you know, and I think a lot, you know, of people hope that people exhibit the kind of leadership and the willingness to not always stand on the sidelines and be willing to stand up for each other. But is there a, you know, you framed it not in terms of a legal obligation, but you said a moral obligation. And, you know, I think it's, you know, one of those things where I also think that it's perfectly ethical sometimes in some contexts for people to just want to be left alone and drive their own lane. I hope people don't choose that path often, because I think we're stronger and better society when we stand up for each other. You know, I agree with you on that point, but you know, I don't know that I would, you know, I don't know that I would ever support a Good Samaritan law that would require it, even though I think it's better. I hope that was a helpful, you know, explanation. I see, Mark, you have your hand up, and I can't, I
Well,
only see
let me,
four faces. that
Mark,
have been-
Mark, let me interject here. Other people are kind of ahead of you. Myrna wants to ask a question, and then Judy, and then Mark. Okay, Myrna, unmute yourself.
Well, especially with Governor DeSantis here in Illinois yesterday, how can he then prohibit teachers, schools from using the word gay? With everything that you have said, how can he prohibit all of this speech?
Yeah, I mean, so Fire actually sued and got an injunction, you know, in Florida over the higher ed, you know, provisions of that same law. There are actually two. What's tricky about the K-12 side is that the case law over the years has never been definitive on where the government's power ends to set its own curriculum. Now, I'm going to make a few distinctions. You know, it'll take me a minute to get there to, you know, through all of the things that are relevant here. But I make a distinction between curriculum, which is what the state decides that they want taught, and their ability to take things off of the table for smart or stupid, ethical, unethical, you know, reasons. Again, the court hasn't set that end line of when they can and when they can't. And that Pico case with the school 13-year-old library is the closest one, but that's not a curricular case. You know, that's a library case. That's the closest analogy that we have that says you can't use raw political power. Show me your legitimate pedagogical purpose. I think certainly if the government tries to prohibit what a teacher can say on matters of public concern on their own time, they're going to be in an awfully, you know, hard, you know, position to try to justify that. And I don't think the Constitution would allow that to happen. And I think that there are also some very legitimate, you know, concerns about the language in the bill and how, you know, a heterosexual teacher who just has a picture of their spouse, you know, on their table could be treated differently under the law from a gay teacher who doesn't even talk about it, but just acknowledges that they have a spouse of the same sex. So there are all kinds of kind of potential vagueness, First Amendment issues. Even if the government has the ability to decide what can be taught in the classroom, you have to clearly set the lines in terms of what's not allowed, or you have a, you know, a vagueness, both free speech and due process problem that I think, you know, it seems to be pretty prominent, at least to me, you know, as a problem in that Florida don't say gay bill, but there isn't great Supreme Court case law on point yet. They've never had a, you know, straightforward curricular issue aside from like Scopes, you know, monkey trial type of issues. So DeSantis is pushing the envelope as as far as he thinks he can take it, and I don't know that the courts will agree with him. We're certainly thrilled that they did not agree with him on the higher ed side where we sued.
Thank you.
Yep.
Judy, would you mind unmuting yourself and asking your question?
Sure, thank you. Hey, I'm interested to know your opinion and insight on the intersection of wokeness and free speech. As in this case of the UIC law professor who apparently is suing the college for a violation of his First Amendment rights. I don't know all the details fully, but just I read an editorial in the Tribune today. And apparently there in an exam, there was a question that's being protested that had a racial slur in it, apparently. But even if you're not familiar with the case, to comment on that, what's your overall opinion of this, of, the phenomenon of, wokeness and sort of this overcorrection of, violations and discrimination against free speech or the First Amendment?
Yeah, I mean, I think, in my view, unquestionably, the question is covered and protected under, academic freedom and free speech norms. And, Professor Kilborn, who is the professor there, had, every right to ask, the questions that he asked. And, what's interesting is that he did not even use any racial slurs, which is, it wouldn't make a difference legally even had he done it, but he had the words, out. It was, redacted.
Yeah.
And, law students need to be able to grapple with the fact that there are, cases that turn on these words, and they have to be able to deal with those things. So, Fire's been very involved in Kilborn's, case, and, it's, I think, true historically that no side of the political spectrum has been immune from being willing to abuse its power to censor those from whom they disagree. And that's kind of the most surefire, test of who a target of censorship is going to be, is to look and see, who's on the other side of whoever's in power in that particular, jurisdiction or in that setting. And that's not to say that all censorship is based on that particular power dynamic. Sometimes it's about, whoever's in charge wanting to stop someone from rocking the boat and not left versus right politics. But censorship has targeted people at every part of the political spectrum, and it's been conducted by people at every part of the political spectrum. So I'm concerned, and Fire is concerned about any time that the college classroom is, regulated in the way that the Kilborn case, is unfolding.
Mark and Sue, you had your hand up earlier, so I'm going to call on you after. No, hold on. Let Mark go, and then I'll call on you next. Okay, Mark, go ahead.
Sure. Before I ask my question, I just want to comment on something that Judy said about wokeness. And there was a story I saw the other day on the news out of Plains, Georgia, because they were down there because Carter is sick, and they were talking to his pastor. And he said that he took a walk with Jimmy Carter to a cemetery, and it was a black cemetery. And they were talking about that. And the pastor somehow got into discussion. They were talking about, well, is this being woke by we're teaching our people about what these black soldiers had done? And he said, we don't consider it woke. We don't consider it wokeness. We think of it as being aware. And when I heard that, it was a very different way for me to consider how to address the concept of when someone tells me something that I'm woke. He said, no, you're aware of something. And it was a very interesting statement. So I just since Judy brought that up, I wanted to bring that forward.
Yeah,
But-
I mean, yeah, sorry, go on.
Yeah, no, my question was going to be about the internet. You started to talk about that before. And the Supreme Court's reviewing some cases right now about what the internet can say and do. Do you have any perceptions on how they may make their decisions or what they're going to do? And I should point out, I don't trust anything the Supreme Court says right now. I don't think they're going to judge on law. I think they judge on political actions. But I'm just curious as to what you think may be happening there.
I'm not terribly good at reading the tea leaves, of what the court is going to do. Today, they had the oral arguments, in a pair of cases about whether or not internet providers could be held liable because their algorithms allowed, content to be circulated amongst, people who ended up, committing violence, ISIS, folks. That's a different question than whether or not they're also constitutional, whether they could be held accountable for what other people post on their services is a little bit different question than whether or not they're allowed to remove, things that they wish to remove for their own, reasons as well. So the court has not granted cert in cases dealing with that latter issue yet, but we'll decide whether or not to grant cert and hear a case on that question in the next few months. I hate making guesses on the on the stream, so I'm not going to do that because it will not age well if anyone watches the recording. I'm just not a good prognosticator. It's the next frontier of cases of deciding what freedoms people will have to communicate with each other, and and what that whole internet landscape is going to look like. With respect to what you were saying about wokeness, I've never been too impressed or upset with the term on either side. I mean, I think that there are certainly, as I said before, abuses of any ideology. When anyone tries to force conformity, whether it's excising language in law school exams or filtering out job candidates in academia because they don't give the right, we would have called it politically correct in the 90s instead of wokeness now. Those are all real problems, but I also don't want to put all of the arguments that are being made by folks who identify as being part of a wokeness movement, that all of their ideas are wrong or they don't have legitimate concerns about the way the world is working in terms of discrimination, etc., that warrant serious debate and discussion. So I hate to marginalize people with a label, to just label one side's arguments wrong and mock them under a term, but I also don't want to give them a free pass either when they are overstepping bounds in terms of how they use their power in the context where they have it.
Sue, give me 1 minute here and I'll call on you. The Stanford Law School, Joe, I'm sure you're familiar with this. Stanford's elimination of harmful language initiative website was taken down because after it was put up, it was laughed at so much. Mark, this speaks to wokeness. Stanford encouraged their law students to not use terms like chief, guru, tribe, landlord, abort, peanut gallery, straight. Straight is a term of sexual orientation because if you're not straight, that means you're crooked, I guess. Victim, brown bag. I looked that one up. They didn't like that one because years ago in racist Jim Crow, they would hold a brown bag up to the skin color. If it was lighter than the brown bag, it was okay. If not. So they don't want the lawyers to use brown bag. Cakewalk, white paper, prisoner, submit, beating a dead horse, hip, hip, hooray. I was curious about that one. I thought maybe it was ageism because we all have bad hip. Trigger warning, I'm going to stop. But this is an example of this wokeness that really makes some of us angry.
I'm never, upset about attempts to encourage people to be more thoughtful about the way their words impact others. But I am deeply critical of attempts to regulate and prohibit people from using language because one group thinks that they are wise enough to know which words cause harm, even devoid of any context of how and when they're used, such that they must not be uttered. And I know that there is controversy over evoking Harry Potter, given J.K. Rowling's politics, but in that series, there were words that should not be named, people whose names shall not be spoken, or whatever. And it's just, regulating language is never, effective as engaging people in dialogue about how to use language more thoughtfully, even on, some of the same, lines. I mean, some of the lines will just not be persuasive. There have been years of UCLA had a publication, I think it was around 2014 or so, of words that it thought should be banned and arguments and phrases that should be banned. This is well before President Trump and MAGA, but like America is the greatest nation in the world, I think, was on the list as an argument that they thought shouldn't be allowed to be made. And I'm deeply skeptical that kind of top-down censorship and regulation of speech ever changes hearts and minds or ever protects people. But I see value in people engaging about how to use language with one another that is more mindful of the different perspectives that people bring to the table.
Sue, I know you've been wanting to ask a question. Unmute yourself, please. Take the mute off. Can you do that? Go
So
ahead, Sue.
I have questions. So here's my easy questions. As I'm getting involved with some books, and I'm like, We Are a Family. That's about kids. This one guy, he wants to get onto a basketball team. He's being really anxious to get on this, but then when I was reading it, didn't sound like it was a good story for schools to have in their libraries. And it's called We Are Families, but maybe it's a good book for high school kids, but I don't know. But the other three books that I really want to talk about is Special Olympics was a big hit in 1970s. They started, engaging special needs people into the programs. And I think it's a great book because it's talking about, in the story I have here, it's talking about this girl. She wants to be a swimmer and she's really good at swimming, but they deny her because she can't speak or she can't hear. So then she took off track, and then the kids were like teasing her on her neighborhood. But she went out in the determination to win, and she got a gold medal. It's based on a true story, but Special Olympics is a true fact anyways. And the last three books I have here, it's called Out of My Mind, Out of My Heart. These two represent a special needs girl that has cerebral palsy. She's deaf, she's not talking, but she goes to a school. And I think these are very appropriate books for special ed teachers to learn from. And The Promise of Change is about a girl that has, she has ideas about her change, why there's so much change in society. And it's like different poems and stuff. So it's all kinds of poems. And this is a brand new book. It's just, I have found. So my question is, back in the 70s, nobody did any hardly hard mean things. I mean, they did, but not like it was back in 2020, where everyone starts beating up on people and killing. This, all you're hearing is killing. You don't hear anything, even on the news. I don't know why they have to repeat it all the time with the news. It's just, I don't know.
I mean, I think I opened my remarks with the increased polarization that we're seeing in society.
Okay.
I think we're all, observers and witnesses, to those trends. We've had eras where, bad trends were attributed to video games or attributed to rock music or rap lyrics or what have you.
See, I was a special needs. I grew up being special needs.
Yeah, I think it's
I
important to have
couldn't be
access
in
to.
a regular school setting. So I was sent over to Little City. I don't know if you heard of Little City, but when we used to go on the vans to go shopping or to the malls, people would make fun of us. And they're like, why are those people even out in the society? Why are you letting them be out? And even my first job, I didn't like how somebody was treating me. So I stuck up for another client that was with me at the time. And no one understood why I stuck up for them.
Yeah. And, I think that there's no shortage of very serious problems that we are dealing with in American society, and I think worldwide, globally. And, there are a lot of differing factors that people are looking to, from, the prevalence of the internet and the way it is used,
Yeah.
to mainstream media, sources, to people filtering out, sources that don't, a long list of factors. I think that it's important, as you note, that people have access to books that are meaningful to them, and that's what makes this fight and struggle across the country over what's going to be allowed in and what's not going to be allowed in so serious. I would discourage anyone from looking at all of the attempts to regulate the books from the same hat, because they're not all the same. Some of them are struggles to deal with legitimate questions of age appropriateness. Many of them are not.
Well, this is like,
So I've got to cut you off because I'm running out of time. If you don't mind, we thank you for your question, but Anne has a question. Anne, would you be so kind as to unmute yourself with your comment question? Thank you, Sue.
okay, thank you.
Sure. I was, my internet cut out, so I'm sorry. So sorry, Joe, that I missed a bit of your presentation, the second half, but I was intrigued listening to Marla and Joe's back and forth, which for me as an educator was pulling at hearts. There was the heart and the head dynamic that was intriguing to listen to. And yes, they're both right. Yes, I could see flaws, but what came to mind for me, and this is not condoning the meanness or the bullying, for sure not, but it has always existed. And certainly to Ron's just recent comment about technology, now you can't close your door and lock your door and the bullying stops. The bullying is 24/7 on your phone, on your computer. I get that. But why is it that 7-year-olds are killing themselves over being called fat when throughout all of time there have been bullies, and yet people seem, particularly in the United States, being one of the more privileged countries on the planet, why are our citizens more anxious, more depressed, more insecure than most other regions of the world that have very significant, and I'm not saying that the problems here are not significant, but they certainly have very significant what to eat every day and how to survive every day type of questions that many of us in the United States are privileged to not have to deal with. And so just hearing Marla and Joe's back and forth, I'm leaning towards not censoring the bullying, the words associated with the bullying and the meanness, but rather better equipping people to handle any bullying or meanness that comes their way to avoid 7-year-olds hanging themselves.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate the comment. You know, for anyone on the video that hasn't already, you know, gotten a copy of Coddling of the American Mind, that's the question that my boss, Greg Lukianoff, and his co-author, Jonathan Haidt, were trying to answer with their, you know, research into, you know, I'm biased. He's my boss. He pays me. But it's a beautifully written book, was New York Times bestseller a few years ago in 2018, and Bloomberg listed as one of the 10 most important books of that year to read, try to tackle that question. And of course, he spends a couple hundred pages trying to answer it. I don't think there's a single factor. I think the prevalence of social media is a big one. I think parenting habits is a big one, in terms of preparing, you know, the road for the child instead of the child for the road, as Greg and John Haidt, you know, kind of put it, are part of it. You know, the endless confrontations that adults exhibit in all the other, you know, arenas are also not kind of good. You know, don't set good examples, and, you know, and we don't take mental health particularly, you know, as seriously as we should in the country either. So I think that there's a long list of factors, not a single one of them, you know, is to answer it. I think, you know, if there's one point, you know, I can make here, it's that, you know, when I keep on saying it's not all or nothing, I mean that, in that there are lines, even with words that cross them. You know, that Davis standard is a real standard. There are fact patterns that it meets, you know, that warrant the actual punishment. But there are many things that can be done shy of punishment to start engaging and start with eyes open as adults to try to, you know, intervene in other ways to improve, you know, those dynamics. But it also, the one thing I would say is that we also have to challenge ourselves to treat our political adversaries with kindness. And, you know, to not view the world through the lens of good people versus evil people, even where we profoundly disagree, as just a habit we need to get into. That's not to say that the other side can't be on any number of issues dead wrong in ways that have real meaningful consequences that warrant opposing and fighting tooth and nail in courts and marching, etc. But recognizing they still have human pain and human emotion and aren't only boiled down to the political argument they're making in a context is also a habit that we have gotten away from.
Joe, I just want to again say, I have one more person I need to call on, but this entire program that I'm trying to do is exactly what you just talked about. I never thought of it that way, is because so often I hear among many people, anybody who disagrees with me is obviously stupid. I hear this all the time. The MAGAs are all stupid. And they may be, but it's just that confirmation bias, and that's exactly what then thank you for your comments. But before you leave us, there's one more person ask a question, and if I don't call on her, I'm going to wind up in big trouble tonight. And I won't even be able to sleep in my own bedroom. So my wife, Mickey, unmute yourself and ask your question. Mick?
All right, just a quick question.
There you are.
You've been talking, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. You know, we've been talking about books and so on, but we're hearing on the news, what I think it was even just yesterday, about the rewriting of Roald Dahl's books to remove some of the offensive description of some of the children that are written about in the books. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, you know, we produced a video on that, you know, immediately in my office, you know, criticizing that decision. You know, I think, you know, Roald Dahl, you know, has written amazing classics that people have cherished, you know, for decades. And, I think that, we can't sanitize the world, for kids without sacrificing, their ability to deal with tough situations. Which I think ties into the conversation we were just having. I think it's a terrible decision. I hope that they, that Puffin and, the Dahl estate rethink, the decision. And I'm a little optimistic on that one, only because of the such broad, widespread criticism it's received from constituencies that Puffin, values and trusts, as opposed to viewing it as just partisan adversarial arguments. So I'm a little more optimistic on that one, but it's egregious. It's a saving grace is that it wasn't the government that chose to do it. There was a private actor that chose to do it, but it kind of underscores one last point, which is that, and I'm really glad that you brought this up, because it's an important one to leave you on, which is the First Amendment only deals with government censorship, but it's not true that only government censorship is worth worrying about. When you think about the number of people who worked at private companies in the 50s who were fired because they might have been communists, that wasn't the government doing it, but it was unethical nonetheless. And there are tremendous societal costs when we try to weed out dissent, when we try to regulate freedom of conscience, what people can say, freedom of speech. The benefits, it's not that they don't exist at all, but my view is that they're far exceeded by the costs. And we need to be thinking about what it means as a society to be willing to listen and practice the better listening hygiene ourselves, especially when listening to our adversaries, regardless of where we are on the spectrum. And that's really, kind of the crux of my philosophy. And I work at an office that, that's evenly divided across the political spectrum. It's one of the unique political actors in the country that really operates, in that way. Our board, our staff, our leadership, very, dispersed around the political spectrum, and we have to be able to sort through in good faith whether we think material is protected or not. It's the only way it works to be principled.
Joe, I can't begin to thank you enough for on a couple of levels. Number one, first of all, the entire program, this entire program, not just tonight, but I never thought of that way, was never meant or never designed or never intended to change anyone's mind. It was only intended to share a different point of view. And my gosh, we certainly accomplished that with your help tonight, Joe, of that.
Well,
There
thank
are
you so much
folks-
for having me. If I may just add one.
Yeah,
last,
go ahead, please.
because I realize that that I'm at risk of forgetting to say it, which is that there are few things I care about more than free speech, because I think that everything else really depends upon it, which is why I'm so passionate about it. And I believe in free speech so much, I'm giving you one tonight.
Well, fair enough, but we'll talk
thank you
about
so
that
much.
later. We will, I will speak to my boss, Scott Fisher. We will be making an honorarium donation to fire
Oh,
in
please.
your honor
Thank
this
you.
evening. But I really thank you, because this has been an absolutely fantastic program. One of concerns I had in previous programs, I love my tempo, I love everyone on here, but there were never any Q&A, never any questions. Boy, we blew that out of the water tonight, didn't we? So this was absolutely fantastic. I also want to make a couple other thank yous. Scott Fisher, our chairman, and the entire Senate committee, the Social Justice Committee, really has been supportive of me. I want to make a special thank you. Ronnie Bender turned her camera back on, but she is our publicity. She's a member of our committee and also does publicity, or she's bailed me out so many times. I do want to thank all of you this evening for coming. I very much appreciate that. I want to get a commercial in here. I don't have a program in March, but I have one lining up for April. I don't have quite the, I'm still working on the working title, but it's really a writer, happens to be the last name of Koppel, but spelled different. Hank Koppel is K-O-P-E-L. but he is he's also an attorney, but also really has studied really the roots of terrorism and puts the paradigm in the Middle East, really challenges the paradigm that it's all about Israeli apartheid or any of that. Working on a working title on it, but we want to discuss that. That'll be April 17th. So we got some time, but watch your Beth Tikva emails and Facebook and TikFite on that. On that note, thank you, Joe.
Okay, well,
Thanks
before we leave, I want to call on Judy to publicize
Oh, Judy's got a commercial.
other
Go
program
ahead.
in March. Or do you want me to do it?
Thanks, Scott. Oh, everybody, good evening. And on Wednesday, March 22nd at 7 p.m., we are going to be hosting a local election forum on why it's important to vote in local elections as much as any election. So we will have 5 members from our Beth Tikva congregation who have served or are currently serving and running for local positions in our communities. And they'll be answering questions and providing insights on their experiences and why it matters to them to be serving in local communities in these local capacities.
And I think the issue of free speech is going to come up in this program too, because 2 of our members are serving on school boards.
Okay,
Hot
again,
topic these days.
yeah.
Thank you so much for spending your evening, chatting with me tonight. Any of you can reach us. I'm at email at joe@thefire.org. Ron, you can always share my information with anyone who wants it. And we're always here to represent people regardless of their politics if they've been censored. So feel free to send people our way. And thank you again.
And I'm going to encourage everyone not only to, we'll put the information out, Ronnie, I'll work with you putting this information out about Joe, but also about the organization FIRE. They're just a fantastic organization, really leading the way. It's getting late. I'm going to cut it off. Joe, I'll work with Ronnie and we'll put a follow-up out on this with your information, as well as the information about FIRE website, et cetera, okay?
And I have that in the chat right now for you all.
Okay, and it's in
Thank
the
you.
chat now, and Ronnie will work on putting that out, okay? Everybody, thank you again, and good night. Scott, shut us down. Thank you.
Good night.